Hello, Modern World History 3. I've decided that our class should informally be called 1948 because I just realized today that four major events of our class, the assassination of Gandhi, the independence of Israel, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and the beginning of apartheid all happened in the same year, 1948. So, hello, 1948 class. Okay. So, to conclude our very mini unit on apartheid, here is a brief history of apartheid. In the 1480s, a Portuguese navigator named Bartholomew Diaz traveled around the southern tip of Africa, which signified the first European to reach South Africa. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company founded Cape Colony at Table Bay in South Africa. And then in 1795, the British took it over from the Dutch. So the British weren't the first to settle there, but they militarily conquered the Dutch, who had. So then in 1877, England annexed the region, and 2 years later, militarily conquered the native people who were living there. Once again, that was in 1877. So that coincides with like the age of imperialism that we talked about a few months ago leading up to World War I. And then there were two wars known as the Boer Wars, Boer, where England defeated some African natives. And those were from 1880 to 1881, and then again in 1899, and both of those ended in treaties that heavily favored English rule. And then in 1913, an act known as the Land Act prevented Black people from buying land outside of the Cape Province in the South African territory. And then in 1914, a party was founded called the National Party, led by white Anglo people, and they're the ones who would start apartheid, which officially started in 1948 when the National Party came to power. Also in 1948, Israel declared independence, Gandhi was assassinated, and the UN proclaimed their Declaration of Human Rights. So I just think that's incredible to think that all those major events happened in the same year. The following year, 1949, saw the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. Trevor Noah, here he is, describes that policy on page 20 as, in America, you had the forced removal of the native onto reservations coupled with slavery followed by segregation. Imagine all three of those things happening to the same group of people at the same time. That was apartheid. So for more on the plight of someone like Trevor Noah, who was, quote, born a crime because he was the product of a mixed marriage that became illegal with the 1949 Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. You can see the rest of this book. It's really good. I actually have only read the excerpt that I signed you all, and I'm really excited to read the rest of it. So in 1950, the National Party legislated the Population Registration Act, which registered all South Africans according to white, black, or colored. So that's how you see a lot of that in Kafir Boy, which we read for today, and how he was part of the black population, and his father was imprisoned, tortured for several things, but one of them was that he didn't have his papers updated. So that's the origin of those lifeline papers. In 1963, an attorney named Nelson Mandela, who you read about in your textbook, launched a campaign against that tyrannical government. In the 1960s, the United Nations, the UN, formally sided with Nelson Mandela and suggested that all of the powers of the world should have economic sanctions against South Africa. And also in the 1960s, South Africa was not allowed in the Olympics because of their discriminatory policies toward people who are not white Anglos. In 1964, however, they imprisoned Mandela for his activism. In 1970, the Bantu Homeland Citizenship Act moved Black people into impoverished regions, like you read about in Kafir Boy, and partially as a result, in 1974, South Africa was expelled from the UN. In the 1980s, South Africa began to witness significant uprisings, and on page 3, my new favorite celebrity, Trevor Noah, says, quote, "The genius of apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other," end quote. So the 1980s epitomized people realizing that even though the power and the controlling powers had broken them apart through different policies, like physically separating them and providing incentives for them to gang up against each other, people who were all discriminated against by the white Anglo people started banding together, which gradually led to the actual end of apartheid. In 1989, the public facilities were desegregated, and they were desegregated, so not segregated anymore, in anticipation of the end of apartheid. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from almost 30 years in prison, and in 1992, white voters, who were the only ones allowed to vote at that point, did vote to end the apartheid formally. In 1993, Nelson Mandela won the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating that change peacefully, so for his activism throughout the years. In 1994, the South African people elected Nelson Mandela to be president. And also in 1994, Nelson Mandela, his South Africa returned to the United Nations. Remember, it had been expelled a couple decades prior. In 1996, the UN helped to facilitate hearings on the human rights abuses throughout apartheid. And thinking back to the Declaration of Human Rights that you read and all the horrors about apartheid that you read in Kafir Boy and Born a Crime, I can only imagine what the transcripts of those proceedings must be. So to conclude with a quote from page 21 of Trevor Noah's book, "In any society built on institutional racism, race mixing doesn't merely challenge the system as unjust, it reveals the system as unsustainable and incoherent." So, despite the true horrors and traumas that people like Trevor Noah and the author of Kafir Boy faced, ultimately the system of severe racial and racist oppression turned out to be unsustainable and incoherent. That is a brief history of apartheid, and I'll talk to you all later this week. Hope everyone's staying healthy and safe. Bye.